So a few days ago, at the time of me filming this, famous Canadian smart guy Jordan Peterson and the guy who's probably going to take over Canada, Pierre Poilievre, sat down and had a long-ass conversation that you could probably guess the contents of, given the predictability of Peterson and the modern right wing.
Wokeism, authoritarian socialism, utopian wokeism.
They're far left socialists.
Socialism, socialists changed their names. I mean, you know, they were communists, and then they became socialists, and then they became social democrats.
All three of these words mean different things, by the way. Social democrats are capitalists. You should probably look into what these words mean before you start running the country. A lot of complaining about how broken Canada is, and to be fair, shit's not going so great up here at the moment. Trudeau has been pretty consistently incompetent and overall your typical corrupt neoliberal. Now, does that mean that Poilievre is going to be the one to fix things? Well, given the fact that he's been an MP for over 20 years and done nothing but prioritize billionaires, big banks, and the elites at the expense of the working class, probably not. But that's not what this video is about. During this interview, a lot of really dumb shit was said. A notable moment for me was when Poilievre blamed the current state of Canada on authoritarian socialism, which, if you know anything about the issues that we're facing right now, is a level of political illiteracy that should probably disqualify anyone from holding any form of public office, but that still wasn't the silliest thing said. Near the end of the interview, Socrates over here told Plato that the prevalence of racism in the modern day is due to wokeism.
Put aside race, this obsession with race that wokeism has reinserted.
Well, invented even.
Invented in many ways.
I know that sounds exactly like something your conservative uncle would scream across the table at Thanksgiving dinner with a mouthful of partially chewed turkey meat, but it does actually get worse. Peterson takes it a step further and says, wokeism actually imported and invented racism in Canada.
When I moved to Toronto, it was as race blind as any country, as any city could be.
Right.
Right. And that's flipped. And it's flipped because of that obsessive concern with race. Right. That was something we 100% did not need in Canada.
Yeah.
Right. We basically, what would you say, imported and invented racism in Canada. Right. As a consequence of policy.
Wokeism seeks to divide people into these different groups and subgroups, and we see the results in a 250% increase in hate crimes.
Yeah, I'm sure the stark increase in hate crimes against minorities is due to fucking blue-haired, septum-ring, gender-fluid rad-libs, and not the far right. That checks out. This is the self-proclaimed common sense guy. Now, I don't know if this is something these guys genuinely believe or if they're just playing to their base and saying things that they know their fans will gobble up, but Peterson and Mr. PP have huge platforms, and them saying shit like this is going to have ramifications regardless of their intentions. So since I haven't done so yet, and since a large portion of my audience is not Canadian, for this video I thought I should shed some light on Canada and its history with racism. Believe it or not, Canada has had a problem with racism well before evil liberal Rachel Maddow reached over to her wokeness dial and cranked it up to the max in the attempt to import racism into my country. I know a common stereotype is that Canadians are so polite and nice and apologetic, but that's not always the case. See, historically, we haven't been too kind to the Indigenous population of Canada. This is a settler colonial nation, after all, from stealing their land and then forcing them to assimilate to the culture we imposed upon them, to torturing, sexually abusing, and even killing Indigenous children in our notorious residential schools, which I'll talk more about later in this video. But one horrendous and often forgotten blemish on the Canadian record is the Starlight Tours. When we hear the term police brutality, it's understandable to reflexively associate it with racist American cops. I mean, the whole Say Their Names movement is a result of the many unarmed black people needlessly killed by cops in America, but this phenomenon, the power-tripping racist cops, is not unique to the US. In January 2000, an Indigenous man named Daryl Knight was picked up by the police in Saskatchewan. He was leaving a party and he had a bit to drink, so it was reasonable for him to assume that he was going to have to spend the night in the drunk tank, but the cops had something else in mind. They drove him far outside the city into the middle of nowhere in the midst of winter. For all my non-Canadian friends out there, this bitch gets insanely cold. Like, you're probably gonna die out here type cold. Now at this point, Daryl is confused and he starts getting nervous. It's important to note that the relations between Canadian Indigenous people and Canadian police aren't really great. And back then, they were even worse. Daryl had heard rumors of police officers picking up downtrodden indigenous people and driving them into the middle of nowhere in sub-zero temperatures as a way to murder them, and that's exactly what was now happening to him. The cops dropped him off far away from civilization with nothing more than his denim jacket. He told the cops that he would die out there if they abandoned him, and the police replied with, "That's your fucking problem." Long story short, Daryl actually survived this attempt by finding a power plant in the area and banging on the door to get help. Now, if this incident alone isn't enough to convince you of the prevalence of racism within the Saskatoon police force, when Daryl returned home, he told people about his experience, which then led to other dead, frozen bodies being found in the area where he was left to die. Daryl's attempted murder was the catalyst that blew the lid off the operation. The police did this to many indigenous people. They would arrest them, drive them out to the middle of nowhere, and just let them freeze to death. This practice is believed to date back to the 1970s and is known as the Starlight Tours. The Canadian residential school system was a government-funded network of boarding schools designed to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. They would practically steal these kids from their families and communities and force them into this school system that was primarily run by Christian churches. If the parents of these children refused to send them to these boarding schools, they could face fines and even jail time. This shit lasted over a century and ended not too long ago in 1996. It's only a year before I was born. This is not ancient history. These kids were not allowed to speak their native tongue. They couldn't engage in their cultural traditions. They were horrendously neglected, violently disciplined, and subjected to unhygienic conditions where many kids fell ill and died. A lot of these kids weren't given any proper burial or funeral service, just thrown into unmarked graves that we still uncover to this day. In addition to this, the conditions imposed on these kids can easily be described as torture, from whipping them with belts and sticks, burning and branding them, subjecting them to intense forced physical labor like construction without proper nutrition. They would get tied up and locked into rooms. The faculty would often tell these kids they were sinful and destined for hell. Very Christ-like, by the way. And most disturbingly, these kids would get sexually abused and raped. And I'm not trying to come off as a SJW or whatever the kids call it these days, but I hope you could see how out of touch you have to be to make a claim like the one Peterson did and Poilievre co-signed. In October 2022, the House of Commons called for recognition of the residential school system as genocide. In addition to everything mentioned so far, Canada has its own overlooked history and involvement with slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which is rarely spoken about, partly because it's overshadowed by our neighbor to the south. It's something I wasn't fully aware of until after I graduated high school. You would think something like that could make its way into the high school curriculum, but at least when I was a kid, it wasn't taught. It's important to have these discussions and openly talk about Canada's shameful legacy in regards to systemic discrimination so we can spread awareness and prevent ignorant claims like wokeism invented racism in Canada, a claim that serves to erase the stories and legacies of those who unjustly suffered in the past and just stir up more division, which is ironic given that PP's initial claim was that the woke people are the divisive ones. It's very likely that this guy is going to become the next prime minister in the near future, and a great deal of his support comes from the rightfully frustrated masses who are fed up with Trudeau and the incompetent Liberal Party. With the probable upcoming election of a blatant opportunist like Poilievre, a master of playing the part and saying all the things people want to hear while actively working against the best interests of the masses, it's crucial that we hold him accountable. A clear example of his hypocrisy is his repeated attempts to weaken pensions and retirement security for working people, even as he benefits from one of the highest pensions in the government. He voted against a school food program to feed hungry, underprivileged children, all while he and his Conservative Party enjoys free lunch every single day. When he makes decisions or statements that warrant scrutiny, it becomes our responsibility to call him out. Yes, Trudeau bad, but that doesn't automatically mean Poilievre good.